do.
Thank you, please have a seat. Counsel, did you do that? Please state your name.
George Gollihar.
Okay. Sergeant Gollihar, my apologies. We've spent a long time with Sergeant Lewis. I appreciate your waiting for us. Sergeant Lewis covered quite a bit, so I may skip around a little bit to make sure that we've filled in all of the holes. So
Okay.
bear with me, and if you're confused or if you need a document, please let me know.
Okay.
I'll start with kind of a side topic. Do you recall receiving an inquiry for you to research all past city discipline for IAs with sustained AR 333 violations or sustained integrity violations?
I do.
Okay. And you conducted that search personally?
Yes.
Can you explain how you conducted that search?
IA cases are documented and tracked within the program we use is IA Pro, and I searched that database under the allegation for the AR 333 as well as the integrity violation.
And that was for all employees of the department, whether sworn or unsworn, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. It was not all city employees, just employees of the police department, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. How far back?
We, like on smaller cases, we usually will sit in on each other's interviews. Larger cases, we both will sit in on interviews and contribute to those. We have to keep each other informed because we have weekly staff meetings on Wednesday, and we have to know the basics of his investigations, because if he's out of town or not there, I need to brief staff on his investigations.
We heard Sergeant Lewis testify that Human Resources is given a weekly update on any pending investigations during some kind of weekly meeting.
That's the staff that I'm referring to every Wednesday. They're present, they're given a copy of all the open cases that we are investigating, and they're in the room when we discuss the basic facts of those cases.
I'll ask you generally, you participated in the investigation of Assistant Chief Slavin, is that right?
48?
Yes.
Yes.
Was there anything, strike that. Do you know how you first learned that this was going to be an open investigation of Chief Slavin?
I believe we were contacted by Chief Rodbell, and he was the one that informed that he had received an email, I believe, from, I believe it's ASCOT regarding that. Oh, I'm sorry. With that one, it was HOSA, Demeanor Mendoza had sent the
Okay. Did Chief Rodbell give you any other substantive information about that situation or about Chief Slavin's comments after you started your investigation?
No, we basically, I believe Sergeant Lewis contacted the HOSA president and asked him for the apology letter that was sent out by Chief Slavin, and then who was in attendance at that manager meeting.
Did you ever perceive at any time for Chief Rodbell to have any attachment or influence or one way or the other as far as how you resolved any issues in that investigation?
No, and in all our investigations, we're independent fact finders, and we come up with our own findings.
Were you present during the investigation, the first investigation, when Commander Minor was interviewed?
I was in, our office has a main interview area with a larger table, and then we, Sergeant Lewis and myself, have each independent offices. I was not in the room when the interview was conducted. I think my door was closed because I was getting ready to leave for a family funeral, and I was trying to get my other report done. After the interview was over and off tape, I believe my door was open.
From whatever you were able to hear or review from transcripts later, was there anything out of the ordinary with respect to Sergeant Lewis's interview with Commander Minor?
They were having, it seemed like a casual conversation, but the one thing that did stand out to me is Commander Minor had made a comment about, you don't want me to go on tape to talk about how Chief Rodwell handled this investigation.
Do you have an understanding of that happening during the recorded part of their meeting or when that happened?
No, I believe during the recorded part, my door was closed, and then plus the reference of go back on tape. My assumption was they were off tape.
So just to go back over that, do you have any recollection of specific words or anything other than going back on tape?
No, it's not a direct quote, it's just what I paraphrase of what I had heard.
During the time period where you were able to overhear Commander Minor, did he mention anything that you heard about Assistant Chief Slavin?
Not that I can recall.
Did he mention anything about Lieutenant Bonnet?
Not that I recall, no.
Did he mention anything about Assistant Chief Pop?
No.
Did you ever receive any email communication from Commander Minor following his initial interview with Sergeant Lewis?
I did not.
Were you present for the interview with Lieutenant Bonnet?
I was.
As an IA investigator, do you have occasion to observe tone, demeanor, or inflection from witnesses that you interview?
Yes.
And would that observation be included as part of your conclusions or fact-finding?
It will be documented sometimes in our summaries about, if they're upset, if they're not, the different tones.
What was your observation of Lieutenant Bonnet's demeanor or inflection or tone at his interview?
His demeanor, he was very upset on what had occurred and was very passionate about what he was telling us.
Did he cry?
I don't recall if he did or didn't.
Do you remember, let's try that. At some point, it was determined that the AR 333 Part 2 violation against Chief Slavin would be sustained. Can you describe how you and Sergeant Lewis came up with the decision to sustain that?
That case was Sergeant Lewis's, but in the discussions from the interviews that we had, initially, which is kind of rare in a lot of our investigations, you had the Chief Slavin that had written an email basically admitting misconduct in that email. And then you had that supported by Lieutenant Bonnet's testimony. He was offended in what had transpired.
Did you disagree with any of Sergeant Lewis's findings in IA 48?
No, I did not.
Later, I understand that Commander Minor gave information regarding other people who he had alleged to have misstated or misled IA. Can you explain how that came about, please?
I believe in the interview, he had made reference to other employees that had not been truthful, and then some that had not given complete stories. Sergeant Lewis had asked for a list of those employees, and then Commander Minor later supplied that list of employees, kind of like a spreadsheet list of who he felt had not been truthful in interviews.
There has been some suggestion here at this hearing by Commander Minor's counsel that the department did nothing with that information. Is that true?
It is not.
Can you explain for me what happened as a result of that information provided by Commander Minor?
Around the same time, the ASCOP's president had emailed the Chief Rodwell, the city manager, as well as Sergeant Lewis, regarding about, he was happy that we were looking at transcripts, and then he made reference to Chief Slavin also having inaccuracies in his transcripts just prior to that, and around the time we received that document from Commander Minor, I had already started looking at all the transcripts of the 15-plus people that were at that meeting and interviewed by Sergeant Lewis, and comparing what they had said in the transcripts to what Commander Minor provided, and kind of cross-referencing them against everybody's comments.
You did a detailed line-by-line review of all the information that Commander Minor provided?
I did, and I ended up writing, I believe it was a 9-page addendum to 48.
To ensure that there was a complete record.
Correct, yes.
I'd like to ask you about Commander Minor's second interview that he had with IA, the first interview that he had in the second investigation, just to orient you.
Okay.
Were you present at that interview?
Yes.
Did you make observations of Commander Minor's tone or demeanor?
At times, I think he got a little upset, but other than that, no.
Okay. Did you consider the information that he gave at that interview?
Did I consider it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And you understand that Commander Minor asserted in that interview that this was an unknowing paraphrasing, that he did not intentionally conceal evidence.
That's what he said, yes.
Okay. Did you conclude otherwise
I did,
for reasons stated in your report?
yes.
Okay. Can you give us just a very brief summary in your own words here today of what were the major factors that caused you to disbelieve Commander Minor's assertion?
Well, if you look at the initial interview with Sergeant Lewis asked him if he knew anybody that was paraphrasing, but directly offended, and he said, not specifically. And then Sergeant Lewis followed up and asked him if, he's going to talk to everybody, did you know anybody that was specifically offended? And he says no again. And then at last, is there anything else you want to add? And he doesn't say anything. Then you go to the second interview with Commander Minor, and if you look at the transcripts, I believe in the first 12 pages, 7 times he clearly defines, and this is where he's talking, he clearly defines that directly offended is a 2-pronged, that's my words, not his, where the comment had to be directed to a person and that one person had to be offended. 7 times he defines it as that. And in the latter half of that interview, he then read the written statement that he had brought to the IA interview and provided us. And I believe it's approximately 6 times when he's referring to his written statement, he contradicts what he said at the beginning. I believe on page 9 of his written PowerPoint statement, on the top, the header is, "My guess as to what directly offended means." I think on page 10 of his written statement, it says something to the effect of, "I don't know what directly offended means." On page 23 of his written statement, he also refers to, "I don't know," something to the effect of, "I don't know what," I'm sorry, excuse me, pardon me. Page 23, he refers to Lieutenant Melissa Palapoli. And he says, "Was she directly offended? Did anybody interview her?" Something to that effect. Well, by his own definition, Lieutenant Palapoli wasn't present at that meeting, therefore couldn't have the comment directed to her, therefore couldn't be directly offended. And then lastly, I believe it was page 24, where he again says something to the effect that he doesn't know what directly offended means. So you take all that information and then you go back to Sergeant Lewis's original interview. When he asked that, he's basically explaining that he had to guess at what Sergeant Lewis meant. And he's basically saying he didn't know what Sergeant Lewis meant. And if that's the case, then it was, the onus, I believe, is on him to ask Sergeant Lewis a clarifying question on what do you mean by that. And we later learned in that follow-up interview that what we didn't know before is that he had contacted Chief Pop and said he and Lieutenant Bonnet were both offended and appalled. That we had no information from that. We compare all that information, and yes, we found that it wasn't true.
Had you known at the time of the investigation that Commander Minor had elevated this concern to Chief Pop, would you have considered advising or working with Sergeant Lewis to ensure that Chief Pop was interviewed?
Absolutely, and I think, knowing how, working with Sergeant Lewis for two and a half years, I can tell you his interview with Commander Minor would have been a lot more in-depth if we would have known that information, or if Commander Minor would have shared that information. It would have been a lot longer than the 5 minutes that it was, because none of that information was provided to us.
Commander Minor did not provide any information regarding his conversation with Chief Slavin during the initial interview, did he?
He did not.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. What did you just say?
Oh, during Commander Minor's initial interview, he did not provide any information to IA about his conversation with Assistant Chief Slavin. And Sergeant Gollihar, is it true that Commander Minor handled those two conversations differently with IA?
Yes, I believe so.
And can you explain that, please?
In the first one, which I wasn't present for, but I've looked at the transcript, he didn't answer the questions. He didn't, our general orders, General Order 4011 says you have to give complete and truthful answers. Those answers were not complete or truthful. And then in the second interview, he tries to provide more detail, but even at the beginning of the interview, he doesn't answer directly if he was offended, and later in the interview, we learned he in fact was offended.
You agree with the conclusions reached in the second IA that Commander Minor violated the general orders of the Scottsdale Police Department and committed an integrity violation, is that right?
It is.
Are you biased toward Commander Minor?
No.
Do you have any personal history with Commander Minor, any animus or disagreements that you know of?
No, I like Commander Minor.
Did any
Documented if you're in the midst of the investigation.
One of the issues that we've already talked about is whether any of the other witnesses in the Slavin IA misstated or falsified information that they gave to IA. We've talked about how you handled that. Is that correct?
That is correct, and like I said, I wrote that 9-page addendum, and at the conclusion of that, I found that no other person that was interviewed gave any kind of deceptive or misinformation.
An issue that has come up today is whether the other attendees at the meeting where Assistant Chief Slavin made comments, whether they had an affirmative obligation to report those comments to a supervisor under AR 333. First of all, are you aware that AR 333 contains language involving, or language instructing city employees to elevate any witnessed incidents of harassment or discrimination to their supervisors?
Yes.
Okay. In your view, did any of the witnesses to Assistant Chief Slavin's comments violate AR 333 by not bringing the matter to the attention of their supervisors, if they did or did not, within days of the comment?
I don't believe so, and from doing my research on that, there was literally 5 different versions of what people heard. Some people heard nothing. Some people heard a comment about a gay newspaper. Some people heard a comment directed who they believe was to Lieutenant Myers. Some people heard something to the effect of something about sexuality or homosexuality, but they didn't quite hear exactly it. So there were so many different versions of it, and to them, I don't believe any of them said they were offended or it rose to that level. So I didn't directly ask them, and I don't think Sergeant Lewis directly asked them about did they report it.
And you understood from your investigation that Assistant Chief Slavin sent out an email on which Chief Rodwell was copied the day after the incident, is that right?
That's correct.
Is that relevant to the issue, in your view, of whether the other witnesses had any duties under AR 333 to elevate the situation to their supervisors?
I believe so, because I believe he's, in essence, self-reporting it to Chief Rodwell, who, when then the investigation was turned over to us, we notified HR and worked with HR on it, you know, and we kept them apprised of our investigation. So that could factor into where we don't need to go to our supervisors and report this, because the person that made the comment already self-reported it and sent us all an email and copied everybody, including Chief Rodwell, on that email.
To everybody's supervisor, ultimately.
Correct.
As chief.
Correct, yes.
In between the two internal affairs investigations, I understand that some people sought records from IA regarding the Slavin investigation. Who do you recall asking you for copies of any documents or file materials in between the two investigations, looking for copies of the Slavin investigation?
I believe Chief Slavin made a record request for it, and he went through that avenue to obtain it. And I believe, I want to say, as cops also asked for copies of it.
Okay. Internally, I understand that Chief Pop may have approached you or Sergeant Lewis regarding copies of records.
Chief Pop originally approached Sergeant Lewis for, it's my understanding, for the transcripts of at least Commander Minor's and Lieutenant Bonnet's transcripts related to the Slavin investigation, sorry. And then I know Chief Pop, it was a Friday because Sergeant Lewis was not working, Chief Pop called me and asked me to email him the audio from Commander Minor's and Lieutenant Bonnet's interview of reference Chief Slavin.
After you provided that material to Assistant Chief Pop, did he follow up with you at all on it?
I recall the following week, I want to say probably Tuesday or Wednesday, because I do not work Mondays, he came into our office and had a discussion about that.
And can you say for the record what that discussion consisted of?
Initially, when he came in, Sergeant Lewis was present too. Chief Pop conveyed to us that he did not believe that Commander Minor had lied. And the discussion was, Sergeant Lewis then explained to him that we didn't know anything of this investigation, and that material, the questions to Commander Minor were material to this investigation to identify, in essence, the victims of this investigation. Essentially, we were trying to do fact-finding, and I believe that's why the questioning was as it was with Commander Minor.
And fact-finding is an understood and appropriate role of IA, is that right?
Correct.
I believe those are all the questions I have.
Proceed.
Sergeant Gollihar, I'm going to start with a foundational question, and then that'll kind of take me down where I need to go. How familiar are you with AR 333 and its requirements and the difference between Part 1 and Part 2?
I'm familiar.
Would you agree that it's the responsibility of all City of Scottsdale employees to act to prevent discrimination, harassment, and retaliation in the workplace, and that employees are permitted to and should speak up and confront an individual when they are exposed to or observe conduct in violation of AR 333?
Sure. Can I have a copy to refer to as you're reading it?
Yes, and I'm actually going to give you something that you may or may not have seen before. It's Exhibit 5, which the city has in front of you. This is the copy of AR 333.
It's not
Oh,
that.
you don't have, do you have?
No, I unfortunately only have just the one that I wrote on for myself.
I thought we had one that Joel referred to.
No, I don't. He had a copy of the old version because the old version, or I'm sorry, he had a copy of the revised version because he included that in his IA report.
Okay. With permission of the chair, just, I can, if you're fine, I'm not going to misread something, and we have something that the city's given in a paper copy. I don't have it electronically, otherwise I'd give you mine. So like, this is part of the policy. I'm not, if I read something wrong, somebody will point it out to me, I promise.
Sure.
So then the next part of this responsibility is that employees are required to report what they perceive to be violations of Part 1 of Section 2 to their manager, supervisor, or human resources. Okay, that's in the policy.
Right.
Are you generally familiar with that requirement?
Yes.
Okay. And then for Part 1, Section 2, there's another part of this policy that says, the legal standard used to determine if the conduct is inappropriate or objectionable is whether a reasonable person, as a member of the protected class, would view it that way. For example, whether a comment of a sexual nature is offensive to a woman would be determined from the perspective of a reasonable woman, i.e. would the comment be offensive to a reasonable woman. The same standard applies to acts directed at members of any protected class. Are you generally familiar with that requirement?
Yes.
Now, is it your professional opinion as a member of Internal Affairs that turning to somebody and asking them if they are gay would be viewed by a member of that protected class as insulting, demeaning, or derogatory, if that occurs during a business meeting?
I believe the comment that we're talking about, in my opinion, does not classify as a one, it's a Part 2.
Okay, that wasn't my question.
Okay.
So my question is, specifically, if somebody in a business meeting, would a gay person feel like it was insulting, demeaning, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't finish. I apologize. I'll provide additional context. Insulting, demeaning, derogatory remarks, or relating to a person's status as a member of a protected class. So that's the other part of it at the end.
Right.
So if
What's
you,
your question?
so my question is, if somebody does that, is it your belief as a member of Internal Affairs that a gay person would find that to be inappropriate or objectionable?
I believe if you're investigating the Part 1 part of that, then yeah, then you would, like it says, if it's related to a woman, you would ask a reasonable woman that question. If it's related to that, if you're investigating the Part 1, sure.
Okay. Well, did you participate in an investigation where part of it was an allegation that Chief Slavin turned to somebody and said, "What, Tommy, are you gay?"
That was, some people said that, yes, but it wasn't directly to him, yes.
I'm sorry, I don't understand your answer. It wasn't directly to him? What does that mean?
That means people assumed it was to Tommy Myers. Some people, I don't think anybody said directly that two of them, I think, 2 or 3 of them said it was directly to Tommy Myers, but other ones that said they had not.
So was that sustained as part of the investigation that happened or not?
Was what sustained?
The fact that Chief Slavin turned to Lieutenant Myers and said, "What, Tommy, are you gay?"
I believe it was sustained under the ARS 333 Part 2. Yes, it was.
Okay. Sir, I want to make sure that maybe my question wasn't heard correctly. Was the fact found, because you're a fact finder, right?
Yes.
In Internal Affairs, was the fact found by Internal Affairs that Chief Slavin made a remark about somebody's sexuality, a meeting attendee's sexuality?
Yes.
Okay. And you would agree that sexuality is part of a protected class, correct?
Sexuality?
Yes.
Yes.
Sexual orientation,
Sexual orientation, yes.
we can't say sexual preference anymore. I just
Right.
learned that that's not okay.
Okay.
But sexuality is a member of protected class, correct?
Correct.
And sexuality is a member of protected class for the city of Scottsdale, even though it might not be under Title VII, right?
Since sexual orientation, which I believe it was added under the Scottsdale Revised Code, yeah, in 2007.
And you'd agree that if somebody asks, "What, are you gay?" that relates to sexual orientation, right?
It could.
You think that it doesn't?
It depends, is it a question or was it in a joking manner? I think everybody said there was in a joking manner.
Okay. What would in your opinion, in your professional opinion, would a reasonable person of that sexual orientation find that to be inappropriate or objectionable to turn to that person and say, "What, are you gay?"
It could be.
Okay. Was that investigated as to whether that a reasonable person in that situation would find it inappropriate or objectionable? Was that part of the investigation?
I don't believe it was.
Should it have been?
I don't believe so.
Okay. You didn't think that was your job?
No.
Okay. Do you normally have an outline prepared prior to your IA interviews?
Not an outline. Most of the questions are formulated beforehand.
Okay. Do you know whether Sergeant Lewis had an outline or formulated questions prior to Commander Minor's interview?
I have no idea. I didn't participate in that.
Okay. So let's talk about the obligations of the City of Scottsdale Police Department for witnesses and subjects of internal investigations. Would you agree that witnesses and subjects of internal investigations have the same standard for truthfulness?
Yes.
They both are required to be truthful, correct?
Yes.
They're both required to be complete in their answers also, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And witnesses and subjects are both required to answer the questions asked, correct?
Correct.
And you'd also agree with me that unintentional misstatements or omissions are not misconduct, right? It's only misconduct if the misstatement or omission is intentional, right?
Right. If you could determine that, yes.
Okay. Is it your understanding of AR 333 that everyone is required to report a violation of this policy?
If they believe it's a violation, yes.
Okay. When is it okay to make jokes about sexual orientation in the city of Scottsdale?
I don't think it is.
Is it always a violation of policy? That second person has the opportunity to basically listen and add additional questions or contexts, correct?
Yes.
And that's the role that you serve for Sergeant Lewis when you actually are there, right?
A lot of times, yes.
You ask clarifying questions or go into more details if you think something might be pertinent?
Correct.
You were asked on direct that it was true that Minor didn't provide any information regarding his conversation with Slavin. Do you recall that question?
The question was if it was provided to me. It was not provided to me. I believe he emailed Sergeant Lewis.
Okay. But you did review Commander Minor's interview, right?
I did.
And Commander Minor actually was asked the question. At some point after that, did you end up talking to Chief Slavin about his comment? And the answer was, I did. This is from Minor Appeal 41. And then the question is, can you tell me about that? And then Commander Minor actually goes into 10 lines of dialogue about his conversation with Chief Slavin, right?
I don't know how many lines, but yes.
I can't misrepresent facts to you.
Correct.
Okay. And in Commander Minor's first interview, he said that he was shocked that the words came out of Chief Slavin's mouth, right?
Yes.
Now, after Commander Minor's first interview, Commander Minor told Sergeant Lewis that Commander Minor had additional information about how Chief Rodbell had handled the investigation, correct?
Something to that effect, yes.
Okay. And he actually talked about issues related to report or reporting, right?
I did not hear any of that.
You didn't hear any of that? Okay. I'll get you the quote. This is page 639 of my appeals documents. It's page 21 of your interview with Mary Cronin. And you say, I was in my office typing. We have 2 shared offices in the conference room, and they were talking afterwards. And I don't know if Joel remembers this or not, or he'll have to elaborate to you. But off tape afterwards, he had said something about reporting this, or something about Rodbell handling it. And all I remember is Minor saying something, you don't want me to go back on tape and have me say how Rodbell handled this, or something like that. Do you recall telling her that?
I do.
Okay. So you told Mary Cronin that Joel and Aaron Minor had a conversation about reporting, or something about Rodbell handling the Slavin investigation, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And Sergeant Lewis did not decide to go back on tape, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And now you know, sitting here today, because we know the sequence of events, that back in May, Commander Minor had reported Chief Slavin's comments up through his chain of command, correct?
We now know that, yes, correct, he reported it to Pop.
Okay. And we know now that Chief Rodbell knew that, correct?
Foundation.
Are you aware if Chief Pop told Chief Rodbell about Commander Minor's concerns?
No, the only thing I'm aware of with that is, I believe, I think it was Commander Minor that said he had asked Chief Pop about it, and Chief Pop said it was in Chief's hands, and Commander Minor said to him that was his understanding, that to not ask again about it or something to that effect.
Okay. I'm confused about part of your role in this. Did you interview Chief Rodbell?
No,
Okay.
I asked him a question about what Chief Slavin had said to him.
Why did you ask Chief Rodbell that question? Was it relevant to an investigation?
It was.
Then why wasn't it on tape?
I was in his office, and I asked him the question, I documented it, I went back to my office, and then I put it in the report.
Is that how you normally conduct investigations, or you interview people about pertinent facts off tape?
No,
How many other times have you done that in internal affairs?
I don't know.
Can you think of any?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Was Chief Rodbell a witness in the Chief Slavin investigation?
He was not.
Okay. What did Chief Slavin tell Chief Rodbell when Chief Slavin was reporting what was said in the Patrol Division staff meeting?
He said after Lieutenant Smith had contacted him while he was driving into work, then he went and reported both comments to Chief Rodwell.
Okay. So you have concluded as a member of Internal Affairs that Chief Slavin told Chief Rodbell about both comments?
At the conclusion of all of our interviews, yes.
Okay. But you didn't need to interview Chief Rodbell to determine if that fact occurred?
No.
Okay. Why then do you believe that Chief Slavin only accepted responsibility for one comment that he made in his apology email?
I don't know why it's singular text, I don't know.
Okay. And Chief Slavin's interview with Internal Affairs is also singular, right? His first interview, he only talks about one comment that he made.
He does only talk about one comment that's made, but he was only asked about one comment.
Well, he was also given that famous question that you guys asked at the end of the interview. Is there anything else that you want me to know? And even in that answer, Chief Slavin only refers to one comment, right?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
And I asked him, I did a follow-up interview and asked him why he did not disclose it. It was his understanding, he thought we did talk about both.
Okay. Now, that follow-up interview happened after the other investigation had already closed?
It had, yes.
Is that the normal procedure for Internal Affairs?
We can open up open up an investigation again if it's related to that, yes.
Is that what happened here? The investigation was reopened?
It was reopened because, yes, it was closed and it was reopened. So I could do twofold. The allegation of the other people that had given misinformation, so I was comparing all the transcripts for that. And then the other one is, at the conclusion of that, I determined that the only thing that was missing was clarification from Chief Slavin, so I re-interviewed him.
Okay. And you guys didn't realize that during the first interview that the union had made two complaints, or the complaint about two different comments. Chief Slavin not only wrote about one in the email, but he was only talking about one in the interview. You didn't recognize that discrepancy in the original report?
I did not know, and the report was sustained, so.
Okay. So it's your opinion that whether he made one comment or two comments, it would be the same?
My understanding, or my thought is, those comments happened back to back. It's one incident. It's not two separate incidents. It's not different days. It wasn't two separate violations of the AR. I believe that's all inclusive of one.
Well, and you don't think that it's a part, do you think that one of those two comments is more serious than the other, in your professional opinion?
I don't know. I wouldn't give a percentage on which one was more serious and which one wasn't.
So you don't have a professional opinion as to whether making a joke about a French newspaper and asking about someone's sexual orientation, you don't have a professional opinion as to if one is more serious than the
I
other?
would say the second is more serious, obviously.
And the second is the one that Chief Slavin didn't talk about in his IA interview, right?
Correct, because he wasn't asked about it.
Okay. And that's an oversight on your guys' fault?
Yes.
Okay. And I guess you say it's a misstatement when he only talks about one comment in his closing statement? Is that your conclusion?
Yes.
Okay. But he wasn't disciplined for his misstatement?
We never, Chief Slavin answered every question that was asked of him, and we never got information throughout this entire investigation that contradicted anything that he had told us in any of the investigations. In reference to Commander Minor, he answered those questions, and we did have information that contradicts that.
Did Lieutenant Bonnet tell you that he was directly offended?
He didn't use those words, but he said offended.
Okay. And offended was enough? In your mind, there's no difference between directly offended and offended? Is that your testimony?
My testimony is I don't define it as Commander Minor defined it now.
Okay.
To me, directly offended is, am I offended directly by a comment?
Isn't that the same
Lieutenant
thing?
Bonnet was, well, no, according to Commander Minor, it's, that comment has to be only specifically towards that person.
Did Commander Minor's understanding of that phrase change in terms of what IA meant by that phrase change over time?
I don't follow.
Well, Commander Minor, if it's my understanding, tell me if this is your understanding, Commander Minor initially did not understand directly offended to mean anything except for that two-part test that you testified about before, correct?
That's what he told us in the second interview, correct?
And then in the second interview, he says, I don't think it has a clear meaning. However, if you want to expand this meaning to mean a bunch of things, here's everybody who was even potentially offended directly or not. Is that fair?
Well, I think if you go by that and he says, I don't understand that meaning, then the onus is on him to ask Sergeant Lewis a clarifying question. He's been a police officer for 22 plus years. He's done numerous hundreds of investigations. He was an IA investigator. I think if he felt he didn't understand Sergeant Lewis's question, then he needs to ask. I think in all of my experience, I've never heard of, I've done hundreds of interviews and talked to many victims and cases, and with the exception of domestic violence victims, I can't ever recall a victim not answering a question because the investigator didn't ask it exactly how he thought it should be asked.
Well, I mean, Commander Minor did answer the question, right?
Correct, but I don't believe he answered it truthfully.
Were you able to reach any conclusion as to even a possible motive for Commander Minor to provide a false statement during his first interview?
I don't know of a motive, but it's not under, I don't understand. At the time of that interview, he had already reported it to Chief Pop that he and Bonnet were appalled and offended. I don't understand, that question was broad enough that he could have clearly said, if you wanted to stick by that definition, directly offended, no, but I am offended, and Lieutenant Bonnet was offended. Lieutenant Bonnet is his subordinate. I mean, in internal affairs, which he knows, that's the place where you get things on record. That was the time to say, hey, my subordinate reported to me that an AR 333 violation. You know, he was offended.
Let me ask you that question about information that you give. Is there anything in policy that prevents Chief Rodbell from giving you information to give you context for an investigation?
No, he could.
So in this instance, Chief Rodbell could have told you guys, hey, Lieutenant Bonnet and Commander Minor brought up a concern, it was brought to me, and now you guys are going to investigate it because the union came to it.
If he had that information, he could have, yes.
Should he have? Should Chief Rodbell have provided that information if he had it?
I don't know. I don't know if he thinks it would affect, you would have to ask him. I don't know if he thinks it would affect the investigation or not.
Would that have been helpful information for you to have at the beginning?
Sure.
Why?
Because you want to get to the people that are offended, you want to get to them as soon as possible. You want to let them know, hey, we're doing this investigation. You want to give the victims, in essence, a voice so that they're heard. They also would lead you in the direction if you need to do any other follow-up interviews.
Okay. Now, you did a follow-up report based off of an email that was sent by Jim Parks of ASCOPS, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that email had basically 3 underlying allegations: that Slavin provided a false statement to Rodbell during his initial disclosure, that Slavin failed to disclose asking Lieutenant Myers if he was gay in his first interview, and that other meeting attendees failed to disclose the statements towards Lieutenant Myers in their initial meeting, but he told you that it might have come up in later conversations, right?
Additionally, yes.
Okay. Were you able to definitively determine that Slavin told Rodbell about both comments contained in the union allegation prior to Chief Rodbell issuing the verbal counseling for Slavin's misconduct?
Yes, they both reported that.
Well, Chief Rodbell said he wasn't sure, right?
Oh, he said he made that comment to him initially, and they also had subsequent conversations on it.
Okay. And you didn't think it was important to record that interview with Chief Rodbell to determine that fact, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Next, you met with Chief Slavin on October 22nd to conduct a follow-up investigation from the initial investigation into Slavin's misconduct, right?
Correct.
And during this interview, Slavin told you that he told Rodbell about the gay French newspaper and asking Lieutenant Myers if he was gay, right?
Correct.
And even though it was contained in the allegation by Mr. Parks, you had forgot to ask Slavin why he did not bring it up in the comment Slavin directed towards Lieutenant Myers in the command staff meeting, right?
I believe so, yes.
So you have to go back and do another interview of
Sure.
Chief Slavin. So then on October 24th, you met with him again to ask him why he'd not brought up both comments contained in the union complaint during the initial interview, right?
Correct.
And he told you that he thought that he had actually talked about it during the interview, right?
That's correct.
And even though this wasn't factually accurate, you found this explanation to be reasonable?
Yes, I found it reasonable.
And that was because in your report, you addressed the fact that witnesses were being interviewed about an incident which occurred almost 2 months prior to being interviewed, right?
Yes.
Okay. So in your interview that we looked at before with Mary Cronin, Minor told Lewis that Minor had additional information regarding how Rodbell handled the Slavin investigation, right?
Correct.
And Minor also told you and Lewis about learning that Rodbell was handling the investigation during his second interview, right?
That's what he had said, Pop had said.
Okay.
Counsel, I think a long time ago, I'm talking today, I asked you not to, both counsel, not to just read things that are already in the record. It also seems like we're plowing over the same ground, just discussed at a later date. So could you please again focus in on this one?
Yeah, I'm literally on my last 3 minutes.
I've heard that before, in other venues.
I'm a man of my word. So this handling language, when Minor knew that I, did you?
Of the ones he provided at the back of his written statement?
Yes.
No, because the majority of those weren't present. I think the only one that was present there was Lieutenant Chuck Cabrera. Commander Henning wasn't present, Sergeant Schaefer wasn't present, Sergeant Conway wasn't present. So that's asking him if it was offended about hearsay of a comment that happened in the meeting.
Well, Lieutenant DiPiazza was present.
Correct.
You didn't go back and ask him if he had a conversation with Commander Minor.
I did not.
Commander LeDuc was present.
Correct.
You didn't go back and ask him if he had a conversation with Commander Minor.
Correct.
Okay. You just thought that wasn't relevant?
And that he had a conversation with Commander Minor.
And that they had said that they were offended and they thought the comments were inappropriate.
I do feel that that's irrelevant because they weren't present at the meeting.
Commander LeDuc wasn't present?
He was, but he had already provided a statement. Piazza had already provided a statement in an interview. Cabrera had already provided a statement in an interview.
And Commander Minor's statement in his follow-up interview that I talked to these guys and they told me that they were offended was inconsistent in your mind with what they said in their interviews, right?
I don't have the exact context of what Commander Minor's conversation was.
Did it matter if they were offended at that point?
I don't understand your question.
Did it matter if Commander Leduc or Lieutenant DiPiazza or Sergeant Cabrera or Lieutenant Cabrera were offended at that point in the investigation?
The investigation was sustained. I don't think you can get a more sustained. It was already sustained.
And the investigation would have been sustained whether or not anyone was offended or directly offended by the comments made by Chief Slavin, right?
Correct.
That's all I know.
I have a few follow-ups, I'll be very brief. The specific reference that you mentioned where Commander Minor said that nobody stuck out. When you interviewed or witnessed interviews for all of the other witnesses, did anybody else cry when they spoke with IA?
No.
Objection, this witness did not testify that he saw a crime.
Now he testified he didn't see,
Correct.
he did not see Barnett on
I didn't recall that, Lieutenant Bonnet. Incorrect.
Okay. Do you recall Lieutenant Bonnet being extremely emotional and upset,
Yes.
overwrought,
Yes.
voice cracking,
Yes.
appeared to have taken it extremely personally?
Yes, very much so.
Did any of the other witnesses whose interviews you saw exhibit anything remotely approaching Lieutenant Bonnet's level of distress during his interview?
The ones I was present, no.
Anywhere close?
No.
The only other topic that I'll go into with you is there was an issue regarding AR 333 Part 1 and Part 2 that I think we have some confusion that needs to be cleared up.
Okay.
You made a comment about you weren't investigating Chief Slavin as a Part 1. You were investigating this as a Part 2. Did anyone specifically tell you, do not investigate this as a 333 Part 1? You must only investigate this as an AR 333 Part 2?
No.
Okay. As an IA investigator, if you start an investigation of a subject and discover more wrongdoing or violations of additional policies, are you empowered to follow where the facts lead you and expand the scope of the investigation?
Yes.
Can you describe for us, well, let me just ask it, when you say this wasn't a Part 1 investigation, is that a decision that you and Sergeant Lewis made, that the facts did not warrant this being a Part 1 investigation?
Correct.
Based on the evidence you had collected and discovered?
Correct.
Can you explain for me what, in your experience, constitutes a Part 1 violation or a Part 2 violation, not with reference to the actual policies, but with reference to actual incidents or investigations or things that you're aware of? How does the city treat different classes of conduct as a Part 1 or a Part 2, if you know?
They would be investigated the same, essentially. I think that when it comes to the fact that they're both sustained, I would assume the discipline is different for a Part 1 versus a Part 2. IA has nothing to do with discipline, but I would assume that's where the difference would be.
If you were investigating someone, hypothetically, who was making derogatory comments, that was, well, let me just say, what kinds of things would you be looking for that would change an investigation from a presumptive Part 2 that would elevate it in your mind to a Part 1?
When you start discussing protected class, you have somebody of protected class.
Did you determine whether there was any intention on the part of Assistant Chief Slavin to make anybody feel harassed or make anyone feel bad as a result of their membership in a protected class?
Yeah, there wasn't.
Is that relevant in your interpretation of the AR, making it a Part 1 versus a Part 2?
Correct.
And after interviewing every single person who heard the comments, your conclusion was that Chief Slavin, although he used the word gay,
never intended to make anyone feel bad with that comment.
Correct.
Those are all the questions I have, thank you.
Vice Chair?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'm quite impressed with your memory. You can sit there without notes and quote page numbers of different reports. Very impressive. Wish I had it. First question is, would you expect in interviewing me about a meeting I attended 3 days ago versus a meeting I attended 48 days ago, I would be able to give you the same level of information?
I would say not the same level.
Which would be better?
The sooner the better.
Is it common for you to be asking people in an investigation to go back many weeks, close to 2 months, and recall what happened?
The majority of our investigations, no, absolutely not. Usually it just occurred.
Is it common that POSA or ASCOPS will trigger an IA investigation?
No, not really. I think it was just to my knowledge, these two cases, the Slavin cases I'm referring to, 46 and 48.
So in the last couple of years, as you've been a part of the department, these are the two instances in which you remember their involvement triggering your activity?
Yes, I believe so.
Thank you. And you're looking back over the last 5 years, I think you said your research was 215 to forward.
Correct.
Were there any IA investigations where minor was the subject of the investigation in that period of time?
I don't know of the subject of any investigations. I don't believe so, but in relative to AR 333 and the integrity one, no, he was not in any of those investigations.
Thank you. Last question. There is a gap of time between the Slavin matter being wrapped up, concluded, and the minor investigation 85 being open. Do you recall who brought forward the inconsistencies from the Slavin investigation that gave rise to 85?
Initially, when we were assigned the case, we had not been told how it came about. Later, we had learned, and I can't recall from who, but it was, I believe, Chief Slavin that had brought that to Chief Rodman.
That's all I have, Chair.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. On direct examination, you talked about Ms. Papoli, am I pronouncing her name correctly?
Palapoli.
Papoli. That she could not be directly offended because she wasn't present at the meeting. Is that correct? Does that recall your testimony? That's
Yeah, in Commander Minor's written statement, applying his definition of directly offended as the comment is directed to that person and that person is offended and that's the only person that can be directly offended. I'm saying it contradicts what his written statement says because he's asking, was Lieutenant Palapoli directly affected? And if you apply his original definition of that, she could not be because she wasn't at the meeting to have the comment directed to her.
just so I understand your thought processes here. It seems that if you suppose, or maybe have knowledge, that there's, let's say, history between her and Chief Slavin, he could be making a comment when she's not present, but everyone knows he's really talking about her. And I won't get into the relationship between her and Chief Slavin.
Explain why there's so many different versions of what people heard or didn't hear. Other than I would say maybe where they were sitting within the room and the level of background noise from the sidebar conversations.
In your training to be an internal affairs investigator, have you taken any training with regard to working your short-term memory versus long-term memory? Why people remember certain things, how they want to remember it, what they remember, why they remember things?
I've been to trainings where that's discussed, yes, as topics, and people have better recall after like a 48 or 72-hour sleep cycle, different things like that.
Do you think that may have been going on, particularly since it's 48 days later?
Could be.
You also talked about Lieutenant Barnett tearing up, or there were some questions about it, you sort of addressed that when he was talked to during the investigation of Chief Slavin. Was there any evidence that he reacted that way when he was talking with Commander Minor, which I guess was on May 10th, 48 days earlier?
I wasn't privy to those conversations, so I can't.
Which ones?
The ones with Commander Minor.
Right, I'm talking, that was the one just between the two of them.
Right.
And so, I'm just trying to figure out, the fact that he was upset sometime in June, I don't know how that affects what happened in May. Do you think that does?
I think he was upset in May as well, because he told us, he wrote down on his notes, he made note of it. He said he texted Commander Minor about it right away, which I believe I think he said like, what the fuck, in his text, and then they talked about it the entire way home.
Okay. And this, I'm just trying to use, maybe I'm generalizing based upon what I would expect, maybe personal. If someone does something, you're angry, and as time goes on, if that's not corrected, you're right, don't you get angrier?
Sure, a lot of times.
So is it possible that he was relating to Commander Minor, that he was upset, and as I recall the statement, he was really upset about the email. That's my interpretation. And then for 7, 8 weeks, nothing happens. So at that time, he's really upset. So is that, do you think that was going on based upon your activities and experiences as an internal affairs investigator?
I can tell you as my experience as an internal affairs investigator, and like you previously had asked, normally we don't do a lot of interviews that are a month plus down the road. I can't speak to how Lieutenant Bond, his level of anger when it initially occurred versus 2 weeks versus 4 weeks versus 6 weeks. I don't know. I can only talk about how I would feel.
You also said you had no information when you started the investigation. There was information from the chief, Burnell. There was the email from Mr. Mendoza. There was actually apparently a telephone call to get the so-called apology email from Mr. Mendoza. Did anyone ask Mr. Mendoza to put some meat on the bones of his email?
Again, that was Sergeant Lewis's investigation. I don't believe that was asked. I think he initially provided the email, but had all the recipients blacked out. And then Sergeant Lewis asked for it again and got the names, but.
I'm going to ask counsel this question, because I don't want to ask the question and be wrong. But it seemed to me, I thought, so somewhere, maybe the vice chair knows, that someone said that Chief Slavin didn't even recall his comments about Lieutenant Myers.
I believe that was his testimony.
Excuse me?
I thought that was his testimony, that initially he said he didn't recall it. That is in the record somewhere.
Okay, because I remember seeing that.
I can get you a citation if you.
Well, you just I don't want to ask the question unless that's a relatively accurate statement.
That was yes, that did happen.
I thought it was another officer who said that Slavin had told them that they didn't even realize that they had come.
I think it was Smith the next morning on a
Yes.
phone conversation.
That is what it was.
And that, what day was that? Was that the 10th? Right, yeah, when he
Next
heard
day.
that, that's right, thank you.
You're welcome.
That he was told, you made this comment, you were upset, he said, boy, I didn't even think I remembered. Okay, now let's me ask the question. There's information that Chief Slavin didn't even recall the comment. And then when you did the follow-up investigation, the second interview with Chief Slavin, gay or homosexual or heterosexual newspaper, so it's strange, but it's not as bad as referring to someone as homosexual. So I'm not sure anyone would want that to be known. He's then interviewed by you 6 weeks later, never talks about it, and then later talks about it by saying, oh, I thought I did cover it. That seems to be a pattern of denial. Do you think he's intentionally denying that?
No, I just think from what he said that he thought it was discussed and it was an
I'm
oversight.
talking about this whole series where
No, right.
there's always this failure to recognize the comment to Lieutenant Myers because perhaps he's trying to hide it.
No, I don't believe he was, no, I don't believe he was trying to hide it. I believe it was a misstep on IA's part. We didn't ask him that in the initial investigation. He didn't answer anything about that. And in his recollection, he thought he did.
Okay, then, do you think that Commander Meyer was trying to hide names of people who were directly offended by the actions of Chief Slavin?
Yes.
For what purpose?
It's not my job to determine purpose. I don't know for what purpose.
So
But
if
it
he
happened.
So if he lacked a motive to deny that people were offended, that's not a topic that you would be concerned of an internal investigation.
Trying to determine motive, no, it's not. He may have a motive and we may never learn a motive, but that doesn't mean a motive doesn't exist.
And paralleling the acts of Commander Minor in the answer to the question of whether he was directly offended, paralleling that to what appears to be based upon other information, perhaps Chief Slavin did not tell Chief Liddell that he made the comments of Lieutenant Myers, that there's no motive for him either.
Well, from what I learned in my investigation, Chief Slavin, in that follow-up interview, said, yes, I did tell Chief Rodbell both. And that was confirmed separately when we talked to Chief Rodbell, and he said, yes, I recall that, and I think we had subsequent conversations about it as well.
When you talked to Chief Rodbell, there was a long time later about a conversation he had for which there was no contemporaneous record. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct, but I think that is in my opinion, that's a very unusual statement. I don't think you have an assistant chief approaching the chief of police frequently saying, hey, by the way, in the meeting I made homophobic comments. I think that would stand out, in my opinion, as a conversation, regardless if it was yesterday or months ago, because that's not in a common versus, hey, what did you have for lunch 4 weeks ago? We talked about it, I don't remember, but I think that's extremely rare than having a conversation about, hey, chief, by the way, I'm self-reporting misconduct to you about doing that.
You're going the assumption that Chief Rodbell will testify under oath that he knows for certain that the Assistant Chief Slavin positively, no question, told him about the comments of Lieutenant Myers.
That's my understanding.
Okay. And when Chief Slavin was interviewed the second time, by then he had read all the other interviews that you had taken, you and Sergeant Lewis had taken of people in his investigation where they said he made the comments about Lieutenant Myers.
Yeah, I would assume so, yes.
Ms. Day, do you have any, Ms. Day, do you have any follow-up?
Mr. Chair, respectfully, can I take a minute and perhaps ask opposing counsel, did you include the interview with Lieutenant Smith as part of your exhibits in this case?
electronically search, it will take 30 seconds.
That, I've been trying and I can't find that.
May I add something? If you look at Minor's list of exhibits, I believe there is an exhibit number 22 that says interview of Smith. I
Yes.
don't know if that's the one you're talking about.
Yeah, page 103. Thank you, Janice. You were very on top of things.
And I'm sorry, Janice, what exhibit number was that?
22.
I'll direct you, I suppose, in the iPad or the computer with me. Mr. Chair had made some comments paraphrasing, and respectfully, that has been a concern all along, is whether people are talking about things that are in the record. So I just want to make sure that Sergeant Gollihar has a fair chance to respond to the actual discussion of what I was told with respect to Chief Slavin's knowledge of the situation. I don't know that the characterization of that is accurate.
Well, just to be fair, so you know, the question is not what he was told, it's what would have been available to him.
Right.
I mean, he's testified they didn't have a lot of information. My question was more along the line of, were there places you could have gotten it? I'm not suggesting that they knew any more than they knew, which apparently was very little.
Well, and I would like to ask some questions too.
Oh, sure, go ahead. But I just want to make clear that, in my mind, that's what I'm thinking, that they had the opportunity to talk to Mr. Mendoza. They had the email, whether they interpreted it as clear or the Mendoza email, whether they interpreted it as clear or unclear. That's what they've stated. I'm not going to say it was clear to me, but it's whether it's clear to them and whether they contacted them.
And just to make it easy to follow where I'm going, my understanding of my interpretation of the transcripts of both Chief Slavin and Lieutenant Smith were that Chief Slavin did not initially remember, and that after Lieutenant Smith refreshed his recollection, then Lieutenant Slavin, at that point in time where they had that conversation, went, oh my gosh, I did say that, I have to go tell the chief.
Okay,
And so that, I'm trying to respond to your
My concern
point.
is, I understood somewhere later on, when the chief talked to Attorney Cronin, he said, well, maybe it wasn't as firm a statement. And that's the only thing I was getting to. And that, quite frankly, it all goes to probably something that won't decide here, or won't address here, is the lack of contemporaneous records or any system to have a written record of a verbal consult. So that's the only purpose that I was thinking.
We will address that, but I do think it's important that we have the timeline clear of
Sure.
who knows what.
Proceed.
Sergeant Gollihar, do you remember, well, let me ask, did you attend the interview of Lieutenant Smith?
I did not.
Okay. Have you had occasion to review the transcript of his interview?
Yes.
I am going to read you a portion of Lieutenant Smith's transcript. Question, and I am on Plaintiff's Exhibit, page 104. Question, and I think there was a point in time the chief said that you ended up calling him directly. Can you tell me about that conversation that you had with Chief? And that is referring in the question to Chief Slavin. The answer from Lieutenant Smith is yes, I called him. I heard that somebody was allegedly talking about it, so I felt he needed to know that, and especially with his position and leadership in the organization. So I called him, and I told him that I'd heard people were talking about it, and he said, "What are you talking about?" And I, at that point in time, I remembered a little bit more of whatever the first comment was, but I don't remember now because I thought it was done. I told him a little about whatever the first comment was, and then I said, "Hey," then Lieutenant Myers said something, and you said something like, "Are you gay too?" And he's like, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea I said that. I need to go talk to my boss and make sure, if there's anybody that's offended, or, make sure that everybody's okay and that nobody was offended." And he said he was going to, at least after he talked to his boss and after he spoke to him, at least send out an email to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to talk about it. Sergeant Gollihar, is that consistent with your recollection of Lieutenant Smith's testimony?
It is.
Okay. And does that testimony, in your view, establish a timeline as to when Chief Slavin's recollection was refreshed as to, were there 2 comments or were there 1 comment?
Yes, the following morning, so yes, while he was driving to work, yes.
So your investigation established that Lieutenant Smith specifically told IA that he spoke with Lieutenant Slavin about 2 comments that he did not initially remember, and that Lieutenant Smith reminded him of both comments right before he spoke to Chief Rodwell. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Does that tend to, in your view, corroborate whether Chief Slavin would or would not have mentioned both comments to Chief Rodwell when he first spoke to him about this?
Correct.
Thank you. Those are all the follow-ups I have.
Counsel, Mr. Smock?
Yes. Do you think your investigation would have been better if people were interviewed shortly after this meeting?
I don't know if it would have been better. I mean, they were sustained. I think they still would have been sustained allegations. I think people would have had better recollection of what exactly was said or what they heard.
And is that really the purpose of IA? It's not to basically provide catharsis. It's to determine whether a policy was violated or not. Is that accurate?
We're investigating misconduct and we developed a finding for that, yes.
Were you trying to find the victim and help that victim
For which case?
for the Slavin case?
I don't know about helping them. I mean, we were trying to talk to them, to give them a voice, to tell us what they felt.
And would you agree that Lieutenant Bonnett's voice was silenced for quite a while?
We didn't talk to him for 6 weeks, so yeah.
Right. And he first expressed, correct?
Correct.
For his first interview.
Correct.
But then after, in his second interview, he actually not only talked about Lieutenant Bonnett, but he talked about a bunch of other people that were offended by the comment, right?
Correct.
And with all of that, so before, his actions are consistent with the motive of having an investigation and having something investigated, right?
Correct, he reported it to his boss, yeah.
And providing all the information that anybody needed, right?
To start with, yeah.
And presumably he answered any questions that Chief Pop asked, right?
I wasn't present. You'd have to ask Chief Poppin.
Okay. And he actually did answer every question that Sergeant Lewis asked, right?
Correct.
In his first interview.
He did.
And then he answered every question that he was asked in his second interview, right?
Correct.
And then he answered every element of the written order that Sergeant Lewis gave to him later on to say who else provided false or misleading statements, right?
Right, but the question isn't that he just answered it. The question is that he answered it untruthfully.
Okay. Do you think he was untruthful in his statement to Chief Pop?
I don't know that's hearsay to me. I wasn't present when he made a statement to Chief Pop.
Okay.
All I was told is he said he was appalled and offended. I don't think that is inaccurate.
Okay. Do you think that he was untruthful when he had the conversation with Chief Slavin?
I wasn't present for that either. I don't know if he was untruthful or not.
Okay. You didn't make a finding or determination?
He said he was shocked. I don't know. I'm assuming he was shocked.
Okay,
I have nothing to tell me he wasn't.
okay. In your wildest dreams, what possible motivation would he have to deliberately, because I think you testified earlier that it has to be intentional in order for him to have misconduct, right? He has to intentionally withhold information.
Correct.
So if it's an accident, if he didn't understand a question, that doesn't serve as the basis for discipline, correct?
Correct, but when we did the follow-up interview, he never said, hey, I didn't misunderstand that. He said, you distinctly asked directly offended, and he defined what that was, but then he contradicted himself later in the interview.
Well, didn't you ask the clarifying question? If we had asked you just simply who was offended, would you have given us more information? Did you ask him that question?
I believe I did.
And what did he say?
Initially, he said, I would say everybody was offended. I think the first time I asked it, and the second time, I don't recall what his exact response was.
Okay. So you think he was evasive during that answer too? Did you-
Initially, at the beginning of the second interview, absolutely.
Okay. And there's no part of you that thinks that you just didn't understand the concept of what was meant by directly offended?
Like I said earlier, Commander Minor has 22 plus years here. He's been an investigator. He's probably done hundreds of interviews. If he truly didn't understand when IA is interviewed, he's been an IA, he's been an investigator there. I think he would have clarified, or he should have clarified. If he truly didn't understand that, then the onus is on him to say, hey, Joel, I don't understand your question. I don't understand what directly offended means.
So you never had to clarify questions as an IA investigator? You realized later on the witness didn't understand what you were saying?
I've never had, in my 21 years here, I've never had a victim say, well, I didn't answer that because you didn't ask it exactly right. No, I've never had that.
You've never had someone that you interviewed say, I didn't understand your question?
I've had them say that during the interview. Commander Minor did not say that.
Okay.
Later, he said, you know, that he didn't directly offended meant this. He never said, I didn't answer it because I misunderstood it.
Okay.
But in his written statement, he says, I don't know what that means.
I'll move on to a different subject because I think the record speaks for itself on that particular one. So you were just read by City's Council some information about Lieutenant Smith reminding Assistant Chief Slavin specifically about the "Are you gay?" comment, right?
Correct.
And then at that point, per Lieutenant Smith, Assistant Chief Slavin says, "Oh my gosh, I didn't realize I said that, right?"
Correct.
And that is materially different than the statement that Chief Slavin gave to Internal Affairs, isn't it?
Which part?
Well, when Joel asks the question, when Sergeant Lewis asks the question, what happened during this meeting, broadly speaking, it's an open-ended question. Chief Slavin launches into the French newspaper and the joke and the tension and everything else like that.
Correct.
But we know that he'd been reminded by Lieutenant Smith that this comment was actually about a person's sexuality, right? That's the one that Lieutenant Smith says, oh my gosh, like you asked about sexuality, right?
6 weeks prior, yes.
6 weeks prior. And then during the IA interview, he doesn't say a blessed word about asking about somebody's sexuality, does he?
He did not. Correct.
But you think that that was just based off of a poor IA question, therefore excusable?
I didn't say excusable. I said it was a misstep on IA's part because we didn't ask that. Correct.
But it wasn't a misstep on Chief Slavin's part.
He answered every question that was asked of him.
Okay. That's all I have.
Vice Chair? To follow up on that one last point, you said he answered every question he was asked of him. When he was asked if there was anything else, there are two meanings to that question, I think. One is there anything else about the comment about the gay newspaper? The other, is there anything else about what you said at the meeting? And he said no. So is that a question that was erroneous by the IA investigator?
I think.
Because it wasn't clear?
No, I think at the time, during that interview, which was at the inception of this investigation, I think we didn't have a complete grasp of all the facts in this case. And I think we should have picked up on that, and we didn't, and that's our fault.
Well, but Chief Slavin was aware of all the facts, and he didn't tell you all the facts.
Correct?
I'm just, so for council's benefit, so I told you at the outset, I'm going to be transparent with what I'm thinking. How the two were treated, in my mind, is problematic and continues to be problematic. Perhaps, as we go forward, it will narrow down. But that is a concern of mine. Anything else, council, want to respond?
Yes, thank you. Do you recall, do you recall Assistant Chief Slavin's demeanor during the first interview?
Yes.
Did he appear friendly,
Yes.
talkative?
Yes.
Sometimes you ask questions of a witness and it's like pulling teeth getting them to answer. Sometimes you ask one question and they're off to the races and talk and talk and talk.
Correct.
How would you characterize Chief Slavin's overall responsiveness to questions from IA?
The way you described the second, he talk and talk and talk.
Okay. He told you in response to the question, start right from the ... And then the answer from Chief Slavin says, the meeting, in the meeting. And then he talks a wide-ranging answer that goes on for lines and lines. And to the next page, question, answer. Chief Slavin keeps talking. There's a 7-line answer about, French newspaper, some other jokes. I don't remember what they all were, but it didn't seem like anybody could remember the name. Question, okay. Answer. Chief Slavin continues for another 3/4 of a page. Most of the interruptions that I saw, or most of the notices of question from IA, sounded to me like nodding or okay or just encouraging Chief Slavin to keep going on. Is that a fair characterization of how the interview went?
Yes.
So you have not really a question and answer format, but you have an extremely long narrative from Chief Slavin that literally is prompted by IA saying, start at the, and Assistant Chief Slavin telling the entirety of the story.
Correct.
Is it plausible to you, at least, that in this very lengthy recounting, that a detail might have gotten lost?
Yes.
You have been asked in this case to differentiate the behavior of Assistant Chief Slavin as far as his truthfulness, as far as his completeness, as far as his compliance with city standards for candor and completeness, and to contrast that with Commander Minor. As you've been asked these questions, do you feel in your professional judgment as an internal affairs investigator that there was a substantive difference between how the two men answered questions from internal affairs?
Yes.
And now that you've been challenged by Mr. Board Chair, by Mr. Servalik, and with questions that I've asked you as well, do you believe that in your professional judgment that any disparities between Chief Slavin's recounting of the entirety of this incident warrant of finding that there was a violation of city standards for honesty with IA?
No.
And now that you've had the chance to reflect on that, do you have any question about the findings you came to with respect to Commander Minor?
No.
Thank you.
Council?
Chief Slavin's an assistant chief.
Yes.
You're about to be promoted to lieutenant.
Correct.
Chief Pop is mandatory retiring at the end of December.
Correct.
Chief Slavin's likely to be in leadership at your agency for a while.
Correct.
How many assistant chiefs are there in Scottsdale?
3,
How many sworn assistant chiefs are there?
2,
How many commanders are there in Scottsdale?
about 8 or 9.
My final question is this. Throughout, actually 2 questions. At the beginning of Assistant Chief Slavin's interview, he was actually provided a copy of the complaint, the email from Damian Mendoza that referenced 2 separate allegations, including talking about someone's sexual orientation, right?
I believe so.
You gave that to him as part of the NOI?
Right.
Yet throughout the entire course of this conversation, Chief Slavin was steadfast in only referring to one inappropriate comment, the comment about the French newspaper, right?
That's what he referred to, yes.
That's all I had. That's all I had.
Trish, follow?
No.
So, I'm sorry, any question? One quick question. During Chief Slavin's interview by Sergeant Lewis, what were you doing?
Chief Slavins?
Yes, when he was being interviewed by Sergeant Lewis, what were you doing? You were present or not?
I believe I was present, yeah.
What were you doing?
I take notes and I listen to responses and have follow-up questions.
Were you aware that Sergeant Lewis had Mr. Mendoza's email?
Yes.
Did you read Mr. Mendoza's email?
I don't
I
know
think
if
that's right. Either expressly or it's pretty clear he's talking about the homosexual comment. At that point, would not Sergeant Lewis be aware, or any internal investigator be aware that the person you just spoke to an hour ago didn't know about it, didn't talk about that?
I don't know if he thought about that or compared that, or if Sergeant Lewis thought they talked about it as well. I don't know.
Best you can do. Follow-up, counsel?
No.
Follow-up, counsel?
Yeah, Exhibit 15 in Appellant's Exhibits, which is page 56 on your iPad. This is the NOI that was given to Assistant Chief Richard Slavin, because this follows up directly on the chair's questions. So it says specifically, it is alleged that during a commander/lieutenant's bi-monthly ops meeting on May 9th, 2019, you made an unprofessional remark that violated AR 333, Part 2. Sorry, I'm there?
I don't have
Or-
the iPad, so
Oh, did they move it?
I've never had it.
It does say that, I'm confirming.
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
I can tell you that it says that.
Okay.
So, IA, prior to the investigation, anybody even being interviewed, had already made a determination that they were investigating a Part 2 allegation, right?
Correct.
And IA also, despite the fact that the complaint alleged multiple remarks, they basically took Chief Slavin's word for it that there was only one unprofessional remark, right?
No.
Well, the NOI is talking about you made an unprofessional remark, not you made professional remarks. That's singular,
I
right?
didn't write that, so I don't know. That's Sergeant Lewis.
It's wrong, right?
Yes, there's 2 remarks. Correct.
That NOI should have been amended.
Sure, yes.
Okay. But it's consistent with Chief Slavin's singular email, right?
Singular rec.
His apology for making a single
Oh,
remark.
gotcha, yes.
And the NOI is consistent with Chief Slavin's singular admission to a single misstatement,
Yes.
or inappropriate statement. That's all I have.
Vice Chair?
Congratulations on your promotion.
No, thank you.
I have nothing further. Respondents, counsel, Ms. Day?
No, thank you.
Okay, call back to Mr. Savak, and he had the last word. May this witness be excused?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Sergeant, did you hear what I said at the beginning today, 9 hours ago, about not speaking with anyone?
No, sir, I wasn't
Okay,
present.
the rule of exclusion's been applied, which has been set forth, which means you really ought not to talk about this to anyone who may inquire of you, because that information could get back to a witness who was not going to testify. So what we try to do is to make sure witnesses come in here and they're only testifying upon what they know, which is in the record, not because they found out someone had said something. And also, it is concerned, because you may talk to someone about what goes on in here, and they go tell someone who's going to be a witness, so that information's passed along. So it's suggested and recommended and would be appreciated if you not talk about this until the hearing is concluded, which is going to be tomorrow afternoon, but it may not be till Thursday. So just we request that you just not talk about this until then.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Appreciate you staying on here for a long time. And so this witness can be excused?
Yes.
Counsel?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your time. Thank you.
And to continue because we're already over the meeting, so we're not going more or less off the record, we discuss whether you want to take another witness or whether we want to talk about tomorrow.
I can't go any later than 7 o'clock.
Okay.
With
The
absolute
next witness I
latest.
had on the list was, on my list was, I guess Lieutenant Pop?
Chief Pop.
Chief Pop.
I'm sorry.
Chief Pop's been waiting for many
Yeah.
hours in the conference
Do you know how
room.
long his testimony will be?
I
Be
sus-
shorter than, well, let's go for it.
Well,
Are you
I-
okay with that?
We can start him. I don't know that we'll be able to finish him, so it's.
Oh, I
up to-
know, I'm pretty sure we won't finish them, but what's your preference? Would it be better to adjourn to now so you can sort of, we've got a lot of testimony tonight. I mean, we've got a lot in, everyone knows sort of what's going on. Maybe now you can fine tune some of your direct expected cross-examination, counsel.
Mr. Chair, I'll request that we adjourn now. I think we understand how the evidence is coming out and have a much more clear idea of what the board is looking for from witnesses versus the record. So I think if we have time to retool, it might behoove us to do that now. And it's already 6:30. I know that people have made records, but we also have support staff here,
Right.
and I want to make sure that they're taken care of as well. And I did overhear some comments without putting anyone on the spot that we need to get going.
Let's adjourn for the evening. I also understand that the room will be secured, so you can probably leave things, obviously not electronic items. So if you want to leave notebooks, I'm going to bring notes home, but I'll leave my notebooks here and just make sure everything's secure. Counsel, Mr. Bellick, you look like you want to say something?
I'll just remind the board that we have a stipulation between the parties due to witnesses' availability, that the first witness tomorrow will be Mary Cronin.
Right.
And then Melissa Palapoli will be called out of order, and that does not give prejudice the city or the appellant in any
Right, no,
way.
we talked about that. Then, we're aiming for completion of testimony tomorrow, so just narrow down your question a bit. By foundation, you don't need, because you can just refer them or refer us to what is in the record. I think you can see both members of the board have read quite a bit of the materials here and are knowledgeable on it, so hopefully that will give you some ability to reduce some of your foundational questions. Okay?